What happens when soldiers are told their enemies are monsters, but then discover they're actually kind people? This is the true story of German prisoners in Canada during World War II, who learned an important lesson about human kindness. December 1944. The frozen flatlands of southern Alberta went on forever under gray winter skies. Snow covered everything you could see. The temperature dropped to minus 25 degrees Celsius most nights. This was Lethbridge, a small farming town in western Canada, far away from the war zones of Europe, where the Second World War was still happening. But even here, thousands of miles from the fighting, the war had arrived in a strange way. Behind tall barbed wire fences and wooden guard towers stood Camp 133. This huge prison building held 500 German soldiers who had been captured while fighting for Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. They wore uniforms with the letters PW painted on the back in white. They lived in long wooden buildings that stretched across the flat grassland like rows of matchboxes. Guard towers stood at every corner, with Canadian soldiers holding rifles. This was now home for thousands of men who never thought they would end up here. These prisoners had traveled a long way to reach this place. Some had been captured in North Africa when the desert battles fell apart. Others were taken prisoner in Italy as Allied forces pushed northward. A few had been caught in France after Day when the invasion broke through German defenses. They had sailed across the Atlantic Ocean in crowded ships, packed together below deck, wondering what would happen to them. They had heard stories, terrible stories. Before they were captured, Nazi propaganda officers had filled their heads with warnings. They were told that if Canadians caught them, they would face mean treatment. The propaganda leaflets showed drawings of scary soldiers with cruel faces. The officers said Canadians were children of criminals and outcasts, people who lived in frozen wastelands and knew nothing about civilized behavior. They called them barbarians in uniform. The propaganda said these enemies would torture prisoners, would starve them, would ignore the Geneva Convention rules that were supposed to protect captured soldiers. Some German officers told their men that being taken prisoner by Canadians meant certain death. It was better to fight until your last bullet than surrender to such monsters. So when these 500 men arrived at Camp 133, they expected the worst. They expected beatings and starvation. They expected cruelty and suffering. They expected to be treated like animals or worse. Their minds were filled with fear and hatred, exactly as their leaders had wanted. The Nazi government had spent years teaching them that Germans were the master race, better than all others, and that their enemies were less than human creatures who deserved no respect. These beliefs ran deep in their hearts, but from the very first day, something seemed wrong. Or rather, something seemed right in a way that made no sense. The Canadian guards who processed them at the camp entrance were professional and calm. They weren't friendly exactly, but they weren't cruel either. They checked names, assigned sleeping buildings, and explained camp rules in clear, simple words. Nobody was beaten. Nobody was tortured. The prisoners were confused but stayed quiet, waiting for the real treatment to begin. The sleeping buildings surprised them too. Yes, they were simple wooden buildings with rows of bunk beds, but they had heat. Iron stoves in the center of each building burned coal and kept the temperature okay. Even when the Alberta winter howled outside, the prisoners had blankets, 2 per man. They had pillows. The buildings weren't fancy, but they were warm and dry. Many of these soldiers had spent months sleeping in muddy ditches or bombed outbuildings. Compared to that, these sleeping buildings felt almost comfortable. Then came the food. On their first full day in camp, the prisoners lined up at the dining hall expecting watery soup and old bread. The kind of food they knew from the final years of the war in Germany. Instead, they received portions that shocked them. Each man got 200 calories per day. That was more food than many German regular people were eating back home. The meals included real meat, potatoes with butter, fresh vegetables, and white bread made from actual wheat flour, not the sawdust mixture that passed for bread in wartime Germany. Some prisoners thought it was a trick, that this plenty of food would last only a few days before the starvation began. But the good food kept coming, meal after meal, day after day. Red Cross packages arrived regularly too. These contained chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, and other small treats. The prisoners could send and receive letters from home. Though the mail took months to arrive, they could work on nearby farms and earn small amounts of money. They had access to a camp hospital with real doctors and medicine. There was even a library with over 2,000 books and equipment for sports and hobbies. The professional treatment continued. Guards who mistreated prisoners faced punishment from their own officers. The camp commander, a strict but fair Canadian officer, insisted that Geneva Convention rules be followed exactly. This wasn't for show or propaganda. There were no newspaper reporters taking photos. This was simply how the camp operated day in and day out. The Canadians seemed to believe that even enemy soldiers deserved to be treated like human beings. This created a strange tension among the prisoners. Many were hardcore Nazis who remained loyal to Hitler despite being captured. They didn't trust the good treatment and warned others that it was a trap or a trick to make them weak. They kept strict discipline within the prisoner ranks, punishing anyone who spoke positively about their captors. They held secret meetings and kept Nazi ideas alive behind the wire. These men believed the war could still be won, that Germany would win, and that they would be rescued. But others began to feel doubt creeping into their minds. If Canadians were the savage barbarians they had been warned about, why was the treatment so kind? If Germany was winning the war like the propaganda claimed, why did Canada have such plenty while Germany faced desperate shortages? Why were they eating better as prisoners than their families ate as free citizens? These questions had no good answers, and the questions themselves felt dangerous to ask. As December arrived and temperatures dropped even lower, the prisoners settled into camp routine. They didn't know that Christmas was coming, or that something was being planned that would change everything they believed about their enemies and themselves. In those early December weeks, the German prisoners saw more things that didn't make sense. The differences between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing grew harder to ignore. Small discoveries piled up like snowdrifts, each one adding weight to questions they were afraid to ask out loud. The food remained the most obvious shock. Every single day, 3 times a day, the dining hall served meals that seemed impossible by wartime standards. Breakfast brought hot oatmeal with real sugar, fried eggs, toast with butter, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the roasted grain substitute they knew from Germany. Lunch included meat, usually beef or pork, along with potatoes and vegetables. Dinner was similar, with big portions that left men feeling full for the first time in years. The camp kitchen was a huge operation with big steel pots, gas-powered stoves, and Canadian cooks who prepared food for thousands of men every day. The size of it amazed the prisoners who watched the operation. Some of the German soldiers had been cooks in the Wehrmacht. They knew how to stretch food, how to make a little bit of food feed many mouths, how to create meals from almost nothing. They had learned these skills because Germany faced serious food shortages, especially in the final years of the war. But here in this Canadian prison camp, there was no need for such tricks. Food arrived in plenty. Trucks delivered supplies several times per week. The storage rooms were filled with sacks of flour, sugar, and rice. There were entire rooms just for keeping meat cold. The waste shocked them most of all. After meals, the prisoners on kitchen duty scraped plates into garbage bins. They watched perfectly good food get thrown away, bread crusts and vegetable scraps and meat trimmings that would have been treasured back home. They saw the Canadians toss out food that could have fed entire families in bombed-out German cities. One prisoner named Hans worked in the kitchen for several weeks. He wrote in a secret diary that he hid under his mattress about watching a Canadian cook throw away half a pot of soup simply because it had cooled down and would need reheating. In Germany, that soup would have been served cold before anyone wasted it. The casual plenty felt almost offensive to men who came from a nation eating turnips and ersatz bread. The prisoners who worked outside the camp on local farms saw even more disturbing evidence. The Canadian government allowed prisoners to work for nearby farmers who needed help, especially during harvest season. The prisoners earned small amounts of money and got to leave the camp during daylight hours under guard supervision. These work assignments showed the true wealth of Canada in ways the camp itself couldn't show. They watched farmers feed their cattle grain that Germans would have killed for. They saw perfect vegetables left in fields because the harvest was so large that gathering everything wasn't worth the effort. They helped load trucks with wheat and watched those trucks drive to grain storage buildings that held enough food to feed a city. One work crew helped a farmer clear out a storage barn, and they found sacks of flour that had gone bad from sitting too long. The farmer had so much flour that some had simply been forgotten and wasted. The German prisoners stood there, staring at ruined flour, thinking about their mothers and sisters, standing in food lines for hours just to get a small amount. The machines and equipment shocked them, too. These prisoners had believed in German superiority, in the idea that German engineering and German efficiency led the world. But the machinery they saw on Canadian farms and in nearby towns told a different story. The tractors were newer and more powerful than German equipment. The trucks were everywhere, so common that Canadians seemed to take them for granted. Back in Germany, even the military struggled to find enough working vehicles. Here, every farm had multiple trucks. Every business had vehicles. The roads were full of them. The infrastructure spoke even louder. Camp 133 had electric lighting in every building. Not just a few lights, but full electrical systems that worked all the time. The prisoners could flip switches and lights came on. Simple as that. Many German cities now sat in darkness because power plants had been bombed or lacked fuel. The camp also had heated water for showers twice per week. Real hot showers with soap. The plumbing worked, the toilets flushed, These seemed like small things, but they represented a level of normal functioning that Germany had lost. The medical care showed perhaps the deepest difference. The camp hospital had real doctors, trained physicians who treated prisoners as actual patients rather than enemy casualties. They had anesthesia for surgeries, not the bite down on leather emergency operations that happened at the front. They had antibiotics, those miracle drugs that could stop infections. They had X-ray machines and surgical tools, and clean bandages. Prisoners who got sick received real medical attention. One prisoner named Friedrich had a bad tooth that had bothered him for 2 years. The camp dentist pulled it and gave him medicine for the pain. Friedrich had never received such care, even when he was a free soldier serving the Reich. The fun and learning facilities added another layer of confusion. The camp library held over 2,000 books, many of them in German. Prisoners could check out books and read in their spare time. There was sports equipment for soccer and other games. There were materials for woodworking, for art, for music. The camp allowed prisoners to form orchestras and theater groups. They could take classes to learn new skills. This wasn't a vacation, and nobody pretended it was. But it also wasn't the brutal imprisonment they expected. All of this created a crisis in the minds of thinking men. The hardcore Nazis in the camp insisted that the good treatment was a trick, a way to make prisoners soft and weak. They said the plenty was temporary, that Canada would collapse soon, just like Germany's other enemies. They held secret meetings in the sleeping buildings after lights out, reminding everyone of their duty to the FU-Her, threatening anyone who spoke positively about their captors. They kept discipline through fear and violence when necessary. But the differences kept piling up. If Canadians were less than human barbarians, why did they have better technology, more food, and stronger industry than the master race? If Germany was winning the war, why were German regular people starving while Canadian prison camps had plenty? If Nazi ideas were correct about racial superiority, why did the evidence contradict it at every turn? These questions grew louder in the quiet moments, in the spaces between propaganda and reality. The prisoners didn't talk about these doubts openly because it was dangerous. But the doubts were there, growing stronger each day, waiting for something to break them open into the light. On December 23rd, an announcement came during the evening roll call. The camp commander stood at the front of the assembly area with a Canadian officer beside him who spoke German. The officer translated as the commander explained that on Christmas Day, the camp would host a special dinner for all prisoners. The Canadian soldiers and staff were organizing a proper Christmas feast. Every prisoner would be invited. The dining hall would be decorated. There would be traditional holiday food. The announcement was short and simple, but it sent confused whispers through the ranks of assembled men. The hardcore Nazis immediately said it was propaganda, a trick to make the prisoners look happy for photographs that would be used against Germany. They warned everyone to be suspicious, to eat the food if it was offered, but to show no gratitude, to give the Canadians nothing they could use. But other prisoners felt something different stirring in their chest, something they had almost forgotten. It felt like hope, or maybe just curiosity about what would happen. The next day, Christmas Eve, arrived with temperatures dropping even lower than usual. The wind howled across the flat grassland, carrying snow that stung exposed skin like tiny needles. Inside the sleeping buildings, the prisoners huddled near the stoves, thinking about home. Many of them remembered Christmas celebrations from before the war, when their families gathered around warm tables with candles and songs. Those memories felt like they belonged to different people living in a different world. Now they were prisoners in a foreign land, thousands of miles from everyone they loved, waiting for a war to end that seemed like it might go on forever. The prisoners expected Christmas Day to pass like any other day in camp despite the announcement. Maybe the food would be slightly better. Maybe they would get a few extra hours of free time. Maybe the guards would be less strict about small rules. But nobody truly believed something special would happen. This was a prison camp, and they were enemy soldiers. Christmas was just another date on the calendar, another day to survive until they could go home. Christmas morning arrived clear and very cold. The prisoners went through their normal morning routine, washing up and attending roll call and eating breakfast. But throughout the camp, there was an unusual energy in the air. Men talked quietly about the dinner. Some wondered if it would actually happen or if the announcement had been some kind of mistake. Others tried to remember the last real Christmas dinner they had eaten back when the world made sense. In the afternoon, prisoners assigned to dining hall duty were called in early to help prepare. What they found inside shocked them completely. The long room had been transformed overnight. Pine branches hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with their sharp, clean smell. The Canadians had made decorations from paper and wood, simple ornaments that caught the light from the electric bulbs strung across the ceiling. The long tables, usually bare metal or wood, were covered with white cloths. Each place setting had a real plate instead of the usual mess tin. There were even folded napkins at each spot. It looked like someone's home dining room, not a prison cafeteria. The kitchen behind the dining hall was busy with activity. Huge ovens baked dozens of turkeys, their skin turning golden brown and crispy. The smell that poured out of that kitchen was almost overwhelming. It smelled like comfort and safety and home and everything these men had lost. Steam rose from huge pots of potatoes being mashed with real butter and cream. Cranberry sauce bubbled in smaller pots. Fresh bread baked in the ovens alongside the turkeys. Pies cooled on every available surface, their crusts perfectly browned. The Canadian cooks worked alongside prisoner volunteers, showing them how to prepare traditional Canadian Christmas dishes. There was enough food being prepared to give every single prisoner a feast portion. Not prison food, but the kind of big serving you would give to welcomed guests. When dinner time arrived, the prisoners filed into the dining hall in groups. The sight that greeted them stopped many men in their tracks. The decorations, the white tablecloths, the smell of roasting turkey, the warm light from the electric bulbs, all of it created an atmosphere that felt special somehow. Some of the older prisoners had tears in their eyes, though they tried to hide them. This looked like Christmas, real Christmas, the kind they remembered from childhood. The servers brought out the food on large platters. Each prisoner received a full plate piled high with turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, stuffing, vegetables, fresh rolls with butter, and cranberry sauce. The portions were huge, the kind of meal that left you feeling sleepy and satisfied afterward. For men who had spent years eating small amounts and scraps, seeing this much food on one plate felt unreal. Some prisoners just stared at their plates for long moments before picking up their forks. Then something happened that nobody expected. The dining hall doors opened again, and Canadian officers walked in. Not just one or two, but a dozen of them, including the camp commander himself. They weren't there to supervise or watch. They were there to eat. The officers took seats at the tables alongside the prisoners. Sitting down right next to enemy soldiers they were supposed to be guarding. The room went completely quiet. Every prisoner watched to see what would happen next. The Canadian officers picked up their forks and began to eat. Between bites, they spoke to the prisoners sitting near them. Some of the officers spoke a little German. Others communicated through hand movements and simple English words. They asked about the prisoners' families back home. They talked about their own Christmas traditions before the war. They shared stories about their hometowns and their children, and the things they missed most during wartime. They treated these German soldiers not as enemies or monsters or numbers, but as men, just men, human beings who happened to be on the opposite side of a terrible war. One Canadian officer sat across from a young prisoner named Franz, who had been a member of the Hitler Youth before joining the army. Franz had spent 5 years of his life being taught that these people were inferior, that they were savages who wanted to destroy everything German. He had believed it completely, because everyone around him believed it, because his teachers and his officers and his leaders all said it was true. But now this Canadian officer, whose brother had been killed fighting against the German army in France, sat across from him asking about his mother's Christmas cookies. The officer didn't have to do this. There was no reason for it. No cameras recorded the moment. No newspapers would write about it. This was simply one human being showing kindness to another human being during a holiday that celebrated peace and goodwill. Franz later wrote in his diary, which he kept hidden under his bunk mattress, about that moment. He wrote that something broke inside him during that dinner. Some wall that had been built up over years of propaganda and training. He wrote that he realized his enemies had shown him more basic human dignity in one evening than his own officers had shown him in 5 years of service. The Canadians didn't have to be kind. They had every reason to hate. Their friends and brothers and sons had died fighting the army Franz belonged to. But they chose kindness anyway. They chose to see him as a person instead of just an enemy. The dinner lasted for hours. There was pie for dessert, real pie with sweet filling and flaky crust. There was coffee and conversation, and even some quiet singing of Christmas carols that everyone knew regardless of language. For those few hours, the war seemed very far away. The barbed wire and guard towers still surrounded them. But inside that decorated dining hall, something else existed, something that ideology and propaganda couldn't explain or control. The hardcore Nazis who had warned everyone about tricks and propaganda found their authority crumbling that night. How could they preach hatred for an enemy who showed such humanity? How could they maintain that Germans were superior when these supposedly inferior Canadians showed better character than the Reich ever had? Some of the loyal Nazis ate their dinner in angry silence. But their angry silence couldn't change what everyone had experienced. That Christmas dinner became a crack in the foundation of everything these prisoners believed. It wasn't the food itself or the decorations. It was the simple act of being treated with respect by people who had no obligation to provide it. The Canadians had given them something the Nazi government never offered the recognition: that every person has worth simply because they are human, regardless of where they were born or what uniform they wore. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. News reached Camp 133 through radio broadcasts and newspapers. Germany had surrendered completely. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had collapsed after just 12. The prisoners gathered in small groups to hear the news, their faces showing confusion and relief and sadness all mixed together. Some cried. Some sat in silence. Some refused to believe it was really over. The hardcore Nazis insisted it was Allied lies, that Germany would rise again, but their voices sounded hollow now, even to themselves. The process of sending prisoners home moved slowly. There were millions of displaced people across Europe, and the Allies had to figure out where everyone belonged and how to get them there. Months passed with the prisoners still in Camp 133, waiting for their turn. Some prisoners didn't leave until 1946. A few remained even into 1947, because their home regions were now controlled by the Soviet Union, and the political situation made return complicated. The waiting felt endless, but at least now they were waiting for something definite. They were going home eventually. The war was truly over. During those long months of waiting, the prisoners had time to think about everything they had experienced. The difference between their Nazi training and their Canadian captivity stayed fresh in their minds. They had arrived expecting torture and received kindness. They had been taught their enemies were less than human and discovered those enemies had more humanity than their own leaders. The Christmas dinner remained a powerful memory that many prisoners talked about in quiet conversations. It had been a turning point, a moment when the lies they had believed began to crumble under the weight of simple human decency. Franz, the young former Hitler youth member, spent his waiting months reading books from the camp library and writing in his diary. He filled page after page with thoughts about what he had learned, about how wrong everything had been, about how propaganda had poisoned his generation. He wrote about the Canadian officer who sat across from him at Christmas dinner and asked about his mother. He wrote about realizing that strength didn't require cruelty, that power didn't demand hatred, that even in wartime, people could choose to be kind. These thoughts would have gotten him killed a year earlier if other prisoners had discovered them. Now, with the war over and Hitler dead, others began expressing similar ideas out loud. Finally, Franz's turn came to board a ship heading back across the Atlantic. It was late 1946, more than a year after the war ended. He packed his few belongings, including the diary he had kept hidden for so long. The Canadian Guards processed the leaving prisoners with the same professional efficiency they had shown from the beginning. There were no speeches or ceremonies. The prisoners simply climbed onto trucks that took them to the train station, then rode trains to the eastern coast, then boarded ships for Europe. Franz looked back at Camp 133 as the truck pulled away. The barbed wire and guard towers looked different now than they had when he arrived. They had kept him prisoner, yes, but they had also protected him from the final destruction of Germany. In a strange way, this prison had saved his life. The ship voyage took 2 weeks. The prisoners crowded below deck, just as they had on the journey to Canada. But this time they were going home instead of into uncertainty. Some men were excited, talking constantly about seeing their families again. Others were quiet and worried, wondering what they would find when they arrived. Everyone knew that Germany had been bombed heavily. Everyone had heard stories about the destruction, but knowing something in your mind and seeing it with your own eyes were very different things. The ship docked in northern Germany at a port city that had been partially destroyed and partially rebuilt. Franz walked down the ramp carrying his small bag of belongings. The difference hit him immediately. The dock workers looked thin and tired. Their clothes were worn and patched. Everyone moved slowly, like people who didn't have enough energy for quick movement. The buildings around the port showed bomb damage, even though the war had been over for more than a year. Some walls had been repaired with whatever materials were available. Others still showed gaping holes. Rubble sat in piles along the streets, pushed aside to clear pathways, but not removed. Franz caught a train heading south toward Bavaria, where his family lived. The journey took 2 days, because the railway system was damaged and trains ran on uncertain schedules. He stared out the window at the German countryside passing by. Every city the train passed through showed terrible damage. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Factories stood as burned-out shells. Bridges had been rebuilt with temporary materials. The people he saw in train stations looked hungry and exhausted. Many wore military coats that had been dyed or changed to remove insignia, because that was the warmest clothing available. The difference with Canada became impossible to ignore. Franz had spent nearly 2 years eating 200 calories per day while his own people starved. He had slept in heated sleeping buildings while German regular people shivered through winters without fuel. He had received medical care and education, and even entertainment while his homeland burned. The guilt of it pressed down on him like a physical weight. He had been safer and healthier as a prisoner of war than his family had been as free regular people. His train finally reached the town nearest to his family's village. From there he walked, carrying his bag along roads he remembered from childhood. The countryside showed less damage than the cities, but poverty was everywhere. The farms looked neglected. There was no machinery working in the fields, no trucks on the roads. Everything depended on human and animal labor now. The plenty he had seen in Canada felt like a dream from another world. His mother was home when he arrived. His father had been killed in the final months of the war. His younger brother had survived, but was living in another region, trying to find work. His mother looked so much older than he remembered. She was thin and tired, and her hands shook when she hugged him. The house was cold because fuel was given out strictly. Food was scarce. They ate a dinner of watery soup and dark bread that first night, and his mother apologized for not having more to offer. Franz thought about the Christmas dinner in Camp 133 and felt ashamed. In the weeks and months that followed, Franz helped his mother rebuild their life. He found work slowly, doing manual labor to repair damaged buildings. Germany in those years after the war was a broken place trying to figure out how to exist again. The Nazi ideas that had consumed the nation lay exposed as the poison they had always been. The concentration camps had been discovered. The full horror of what had been done in Germany's name became known. The lies and propaganda that had seemed so convincing during the war looked ridiculous and evil in hindsight. Franz never forgot his time in Canada. As years passed and Germany slowly recovered, as he married and had children and built a new life in a new Germany that rejected everything the Third Reich stood for, he carried those memories with him. He told his children about the Christmas dinner when they were old enough to understand. He told them about the Canadian officer who showed kindness to an enemy. He told them what he had learned in that prison camp about the difference between what leaders say and what is actually true. In an interview conducted in the 1980s, when Franz was an old man and Germany had become a successful democracy, he reflected on those years. He said that he learned more about being truly human from his enemies than he ever learned from his own government. He said, the Canadian officers didn't have to invite prisoners to sit at their table for Christmas dinner, but they did it anyway, because they believed all people deserved dignity regardless of nationality or circumstance. He said that single act of kindness taught him that ideology is cheap and easy, but real human decency is priceless and rare. The lesson carried by Franz and thousands of other German prisoners who experienced similar treatment during the war had lasting impact. Many of these men became voices for democracy and human rights in post-war Germany. They had seen firsthand that strength didn't require cruelty, that security didn't demand hatred, and that even during the worst conflict in human history, basic humanity could survive and even grow strong. They had been told their enemies were barbarians, but they discovered that barbarism lived in the ideology they had served, not in the people they had fought against. The Christmas dinner at Camp 133 in December 1944 wasn't about Canadian generosity or Allied superiority. It was about something simpler and more important. It was about the choice to treat people as human beings even when you don't have to, even when they are your enemies, even when no one is watching and no one will give you credit. That choice, repeated by Canadian officers and guards throughout the war at camps across their country, helped plant seeds that grew into a better Germany after the Nazi nightmare ended. The barbarians, it turned out, had never been the Canadians at all. The real barbarism had been the ideology that taught young men like Franz to see other humans as less than human. And it took only one dinner, one simple act of breaking bread together, to begin breaking that ideology's power over hearts and minds. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, kindness has the power to change minds and hearts, even in the darkest times. Subscribe to hear more incredible true stories about humanity and hope.